sucks. No, decent. That's a keeper. There we go. Nope, he's shaking his head.
Hey, what's up guys? I'm Nick the Informative Fisherman, and today I want to talk to you about wacky rigging. A lot of videos out there don't explain the intricacies of doing it, so I would like to show you how to do it and how I personally do it myself. Basically, wacky rigging just means taking any soft plastic bait, folding it in half, sticking it right through the middle. It's not defined by the hook, but most hooks that are being used on wacky rigs are mosquito hooks. If you're using bigger baits, you can use bigger hooks, but we'll get into that. You can see the wacky rig hook right there in the middle. If it's falling down, the worm's going to twitch quite nicely and hover down to the bottom. Now, let me start explaining a little bit more detail for you. A lot of the guys don't explain to you the rods, okay? They tell you, okay, you want a fast action spinning rod. Well, that's really not the case. If you're throwing a bigger bait, you can use bigger rods, you know. If you're throwing lighter line, you would use a different action. And let me explain a little bit more what that's about. Right here, I'm throwing a 6-inch Zoom trick worm. This is really light. This is 8-pound fluorocarbon line. So if I had this on a big bait casting rod and reel, it would be way too strong. And if I set the hook real tough, bam, it's going to snap it. So what I actually have right here on my 8-pound fluorocarbon is a fast action spinning rod, meaning the action is just where your rod bends. It's bending up more towards the tip, so I can make more accurate cast with the fast action rod, and I have a lot of backbone back here to still control the fish and somewhat pull them away. It's still light enough, the rod. This is a medium weight rod, okay? A lot of time people will say, medium, heavy, and that's the weight of the rod, the backbone of the rod. The action is where your rod bends for that cushion. The fast action gives you controlled accuracy and a little bit more power over your moderate, which bend in the middle, which give you a little bit more casting distance, but they put a lot more cushion on the fish so you can get away with using lighter line. So that's a little bit more explanation on the rod for you. Now let me get over here to this one. And what I have here is the exact same setup, but this is 20-pound braided line. I fished this in the California Delta. It's dirty, so I can get away with using braided line. 20 pounds, a lot of people ask, whoa, dude, that's overkill on a wacky rig, don't you think? But the reality is 20-pound braided line is only 6-pound diameter in the line, so it's actually more narrow than my fluorocarbon line, which is 8-pound diameter, and this is 6. The reason why I use this is there's a lot of vegetation on the bottom. In a wacky rig, this is such a light setup. I set the hook on a bass, he's going to run down under some mats, some milfoil, get under there, and that line just can't hold up. This braided line, really strong, 20 pound, 6-pound diameter. It's going to cut right through that mat, and I can just hold them there. I don't want to yank the fish out. You have to take your time when you're using spinning tackle. It's not for power, it's for finesse, meaning light line, little lures, slow moving objects, really taking your time with the bass. Don't fight them with these guys. And I'm using this braided line so I can get away with a lot extra. And this one right here is actually a moderate fast. See that bending in the middle? Just like that. And a lot of people are asking me, dude, Nick, you can't control the wacky rig. That's okay. I'm throwing it out there. My worm's falling real slow. This one happens to be a Zoom trick worm, so the fall is really slow. I'm using a little light wire 2-aught mosquito hook, which is hardly any weight. So it's fine. I'll throw it out there. Plus, I get a massive hook set on the fish. I can set it real hard. I'm not over strengthening the fish. I'm not pulling it loose. The hook's going to plant in there quite nice. I'm not trying to bulldog him back to the boat. I'll take my time. And that moderate right there, if he swims at me, my rod's going to suck up a lot of that line for me, because spinning reels are not as fast as bait casting reels when it comes to retrieving line. So a lot of the time, if I have strong line on, I'll get that moderate fast because I have a much bigger cushion, much bigger bend, to where if they swim up towards me real quick, that rod's going to suck up a lot of that free line, not allowing them to shake the hook by keeping constant tension. So that's your Zoom trick worm. Now let me show you the baits. So the most common baits on the market today that are often wacky rigged and used on the professional circuit are your 6-inch zoom trick worm, which falls very slowly if rigged correctly on light line and a light hook. That's where you need your spinning tackle. Then you have your 6-inch Gary Yamamoto standard Senko. This is just the very first most common Senko that they came out with. It's your standard 6-inch, which is a much fatter bait that has a high amount of salt impregnation on it. This bait tends to fall a little bit faster, and it's a much heavier bait. You know, you're looking at a much heavier bait here to where you don't necessarily have to use spinning tackle. This is where you can grab your bait casting gear and get away with stronger line and a stronger rod and a bigger hook. And that's your Gary Yamamoto Senko. But in the reverse, you have your 3-inch Gary Yamamoto Senkos, and that's when I want to go back to my spinning tackle. On a 3-inch bait, this is when you're gonna throw this bait when you're having a very difficult time getting strikes. You can see bass, you're throwing everything: spinner baits, jerk baits, crank baits, jigs. You're hitting them with everything you got in your tackle box. You're even throwing 6-inch worms, and they're just looking at it. Yeah, they're just looking at it. This is where you're going to switch over to your 3-inch little natural baits like this. And this is where you're going to want to drop down to, I say, never go lower than 6-pound tests. And when I'm wacky rigging, I'm only using fluorocarbon line and braided line because there's no stretch. It's very stiff. If that fish picks it up, I can feel it immediately. So another crucial part to this is when you cast out there, you don't want to keep tight line. If it's tight, your worm's going to pendulum back at you. If you've ever heard about penduluming jigs, when you're throwing them up in a tree, you want to give it free line so it falls naturally. It's the same thing with the soft plastic on a wacky rig. You cast it out there, don't keep your line tight. The worm's going to pull away from your target. What you're going to do is you're going to cast it out there, leave your rod tip high as the worm makes impact. Once it makes impact, bring your rod tip down to a 9 o'clock. Therefore, you gave that worm a lot of free line, probably getting down 5 or 6 feet, which is your average casting range, you know, for a bass that's actually on structure or cover. So that worm falls real natural. Now, a very crucial part to this, I see a lot of guys make that cast and they turn over and start talking to me. It's a big mistake. You actually want to watch that slack line. So I generally turn my rod tip into the sun and I can see that reflection on my slack line. So if I see my line start to tighten up real quick, or I see my line move against the current or move against the wind, I'll immediately reel down. If you feel any sort of pressure at that point, set the hook. Another thing, we're using light line and a light rod. Where you set the hook is crucial. On a spinning tackle with light line and a light rod, you want to sweep hook set. You have a very tiny, sharp hook. If you jam it home, it's just probably going to break your line because you're using light line, therefore you're putting more pressure on that little tiny knot. Don't jam it home. Wacky rig, the hook's exposed, okay? It's already in that bass's mouth. If you sweep hook set, just come across real fast. I'm going to reel this worm up and show you exactly what it looks like. Dunk, dunk, sweep. That's it. Dunk, dunk, sweep. That's it. Feel a little bit of pressure, sweep. Just pull that rod up to a high position and you're going to put enough pressure on that little mosquito hook to penetrate that bass's mouth. So don't jam it home. But remember, in the reverse, you're throwing a big Senko, now you're on bait casting gear. Right here, I have 50-pound braid, okay? Now you know that braid, 50-pound, is now in a much smaller diameter. So you can get away with casting that Senko up there. I'm on bait casting gear, fast action rod. Now I'm gonna snap hook set, right up to the top. Big, powerful hook set, come across your body, back across your body, completely vertical, it doesn't matter. This is a single hook, it's pointing upright. Jam it home on your bait casting gear or it's strong. I say you can use a snap hook set, boom, a big hard hook set if you're on 15-pound tests and up. If you're less than that and you got an exposed hook, sweep hook set. You're gonna get away with a lot more good quality hookups instead of breaking fish off that way. Okay, so I see my target. I'm looking at my target, it's the edge of a weed line. I make a nice little smooth cast out there. I lower my rod tip, let that worm fall on slack line. I'm watching my line. I go to close my bail. I do not want to reel to close my bail. That's going to cause a little line loop in there, maybe half an inch at a time. But what that's going to lead to is you not paying attention. There's going to get little line loops. One can slip over the top of that spool and give you some backlash or some awkward line twist, and next thing you know, you're going to get a loop in there. You're going to want to make a cast to a fish. oh, it's going to get caught up halfway, you're going to have some backlash, and next thing you know, you're sitting there trying to untangle your line in the boat. So always close manually. You can take a look, take a look, make sure it's in there, and then watch your line again. That's going to save you a lot of time on the boat. It's going to keep that worm in action. It's going to keep that wacky rig ready to play, ready to go at all times. Don't waste time. You get backlash. This is why I bring a lot of extra rods on the boat. I do this professionally, but at the same time, you have to understand mistakes are going to happen with everyone. So optimize your time on the water. Keep that bait in the water. Do everything you can to optimize your fishing experience and, stay out there. You got to stay on them. So here's what I'm talking about. I've made my cast, my bail's open. Watch. I'm going to start to reel. It closes right there. Now if I run it back, you can see there's a little bit of slack line right in there. It's microscopic. Sure, a few casts I'm going to be able to get away with it, but if I keep doing that, guess what's going to happen? It's going to end up slipping over the top of that spool or coming under the edge. I'm sure you've seen it before. You're like, how the heck did that thing get under there? And next thing you know, that rod's sitting at the bottom of the boat. You run into that time where the bass is right there and you're like, man, I wish I could drop a wacky rig on his head, but guess what? You didn't close manually. Big mistake. Always close that thing manually, check your line. Another thing, before you start to retrieve, you could actually lift right there, and that'll tighten up the line to get it back onto the spool. I see a lot of guys hold down when the line's slack and start to retrieve that way, but lifting will actually tighten that line a little bit as well and really help you out, keep your line tight.
All right, now let's talk about rigging a wacky rig. First thing you need, your little 1/0 or 2/0 mosquito hook like so. What I like to use is a little tiny black rubber band, I'll tell you why. And any sort of soft plastic, it's basically just hooked in the middle, defies a wacky rig. Now conventionally, you would take your mosquito hook, go directly through the middle of the worm, you fold it over, find that point, stick it through, and twitch it around on the end of there. Problem with that, a lot of soft plastics don't hold up after one fish, and the next bass comes up, boom, goes to inhale it, sucks your worm off the hook never makes it to the bass's mouth. Bad news. Then you have your O-ring rig, which has a tendency of lining up that mosquito hook the same direction the worm is pointed. So if a bass comes up from the backside, you're going to miss a lot of strikes like that, short strikes. Another problem is a lot of guys will go through that O-ring and skin hook the worm to where it sits in this position. The problem is with that, once the bass takes it and the O-ring is set up across the worm, so even if you skin hook it, once you set the hook, that hook's going to pull over into this position here. Bad news, you don't want the hook to be turning in the fish's mouth when you set that hook. So you don't want that. So what I actually choose to do is use a little tiny black rubber band that you can find at a women's salon. It's for, doing their hair up, or any other store that carries a little black rubber band. And I'm going to show you exactly how I rig this. You don't need any special tools or anything, just your hands and a little black rubber band, and the success rate is going to be phenomenal compared to your standard rigging and your O-ring. Alright, now let me show you what I do with this little bad boy. I take that little black rubber band, I go right across my worm, I find the middle of my worm, doesn't matter too much at this point. I twist the rubber band, go around, that's 1, 2, 3, and I actually like to do it about 3 to 4 times depending on your rubber band size. Okay, now it looks like we're left with a real mess here with the rubber band going every which direction around the worm. Here exactly is what I am looking for. You see this little cross right here? I want to take the hook right below it and come out the top, in between. Therefore, it'll hold my hook in the correct position even when I set the hook. It won't twist off to the side. It'll hold perfectly, give me a lot of durability to the worm. So now what I want to make sure is, before I stick the hook through there, that this little cross is still directly in the center of my worm. So let's go ahead and line up that. Okay, so I went ahead and rolled my rubber band up to the center of my worm. You can still see that nice little cross there. I didn't need any special tools to do this, just my fingers, but I have 10 of them, so I mean, how special could they be? So I'm going to just take my mosquito hook, come right back through there, right through the top, make sure the center of my hook's lined up right with where it's crossing each other. So let me go ahead and put it through there and give you another close-up. Okay, now you can see I have the hook going right between where it's crossing over. So I have a lot of support right there for my worm. The hook's just not going to pop out freely. It's going to keep my hook in the correct position even when I set the hook. Now you can see the rubber band's a little bit spread out, so I can just go ahead and compress that with my fingers, just to make sure the worm has the proper action, or I can leave it spread out. It really doesn't matter too much, but just for my personal preference, I like to cram it all in and make it look pretty. And there you have it, all compressed up, real pretty looking. The hook going right through there. I'll lift up on it. You can see it's not pulling to the side at all. It's pulling the hook nice and straight. If I twist, you see the worm twist and roll over. See it roll over? That's how you know you got it just right. When you set that hook, it shouldn't pull to the side. It should pull vertically back. These are light wire mosquito hooks. If you use an O-ring, it's going to pull and twist and tear to the side. Give that bass a much bigger potential of shaking off that hook. And there you have it.
Now, you've probably heard guys talk about weighting your soft plastics. Now, they do have those lead weights out there, little nail weights where you can put them in, break them off. Those are fantastic, but a lot of the time that I find in the field is sometimes you have a real skinny worm or a real fat worm, and I like to have, different diameters in nails. So I basically just take your standard household nails, any nail you want as long as you can cut through it. I take a pair of pliers right here in the cutter. I got my nail right here. I'm going to go right in, cut it off. Now I have a nice little nail, just like that. Now let's say I want my Senko to fall faster. I know those bass are at 8 feet, but I'm tired of waiting 4 or 5 seconds to get it down there. I want to maximize my time on each cast. I want to get it to the bottom, twitch, twitch, reel it up, cast again. So I basically got that nail. I got my Senko. I'm going to wet it, and I'm going to push it right into the worm. Now guess what? I got him right in that Senko. Now, when I wacky rig that Senko, he's going to fall in. So if I throw him up to a boat dock and this end hits first, he's going to dive right under that dock. But at the same time, I'm kind of defeating the purpose of that middle twitch. So you can cut off another nail, enter it in the backside, and guess what? It's still going to hold that exact same wacky rig style of bouncing in the middle, just like that. So why I go with nails is you can get different size diameters, different size baits. Little skinny baits, you want a little skinny nail. You're using light line anyways. You may say, oh, that's going to make a microscopic difference. But guess what catches bass consistently? Microscopic differences and good decisions. Bringing nails with you is always a good decision. Now, another thing I see a lot of really good, talented anglers have in their box but never use is little tiny rattles, okay? The little rattles for inserting into your soft plastics. Brush hogs, worms, anything. You can get them in all different sizes. They make a little tiny rattle. You just lick them, jam them into your bait. Now, a lot of guys make this mistake. I have a natural color bait here. This is for clean, clear water. I need something very natural with no sparkle in it, no shine. I just want them to think this is something natural that fell out of the sky. Natural, you don't want to make noise. If I'm fishing muddy water, I'll use a white Senko or a white trick worm. That's when I want to lick that bead, put it in there so I get these little rattles shaken to cause extra attention in that muddy water. Real windy day, sometimes you can't see them. Sometimes the bass need a little bit better attention to hone in on that bait. Add a rattle, okay? Natural colors, no rattles, and you want sparkle. For your dirty, dingy water, your muds, your chocolates, your real windy, choppy water, a lot of the time you're not going to be wacky rigging at that point, but just basically stick to your muddy waters. You want to pick either a black or a black with red flake, or a fluorescent. You can go with your pinks, your whites. Baits like that are going to give that bass that extra opportunity to hone in on it. Add rattles at that point. You want the fish to see it. It's dingy. He's going to have to find it to eat it. A lot of the time guys will keep throwing and say, hey, guess what? They weren't hitting it. Wrong. They couldn't see it. Okay, another thing that I haven't covered with you yet. If you're fishing clear water and you still want to use real strong braided line because it's that smaller diameter, in clear water, if you have a worm falling that looks completely natural on a tiny mosquito hook and they see braided line going to it, guess what? It's completely unnatural. So this is where you'd want to use a leader. A lot of guys ask me, Nick, how long of a leader do you use? Honestly, you only need about a 2-foot leader. Just enough clear line right behind that, and use fluorocarbon line. If you're using a little bit stiffer of a rod because you couldn't afford something with a little bit more cushion in it, I understand that. And there you want to use about 2.5, 3 foot monofilament leader. And the reason for that is it stretches. So it'll give you a little bit more cushion if you have a tendency of setting the hook too hard. It'll stretch a little bit and it won't immediately rip through that fish's mouth. Okay, another huge mistake that I see take place when guys are wacky rigging because they traditionally fish bait casters all the time and they're not used to utilizing their drag. Drag is on every single fishing reel. It's there for a reason. And that reason for it is you have that reel matching up to that rod. If this rod I'm using right here is moderate fast, meaning it bends in the middle, I want my drag to start letting loose, free line, once my rod is pushing past that action point. Meaning, if my drag's so tight to where my rod reaches that medium fast point, which is that bend in the center, and it's not letting off any line, guess what? I might end up busting my rod. So what I want to do is make sure my drag is set just enough to where my rod reaches that point, reaches that action point, and a little bit extra, it's going to feed off that drag. It's fine. We're taking our time with the fish. Utilize your drag. Trust me, the fish is going to tire himself out. You try to horse him on spinning tackle, you're making a mistake. You got those light hooks, it's going to rip through them. Don't miss the opportunity for a killer fish. All right, now for another thing that I see commonly take place, which is a huge mistake in all of fishing, not just bass fishing in general, is any place that has current, meaning a dam's running and the dam's creating current, or the wind's blowing hard and it's coming across, that's developing a current. It's running one particular direction, meaning the bugs, everything in there is naturally going to be blowing one direction. When you cast the worm, you want it to go at that same speed that everything else is going in that current. So don't sit up current of it, cast down, and retrieve against it. Your worm's going to be pulling against the current. What natural worm has ever fell out of a tree and swim against, a 1 knot current? It just doesn't happen. So it's very unnatural for any fish to see any sort of little soft plastic thing swimming against it. If you're using a lure like a crankbait or a spinnerbait, it looks more like a fish or a crawdad, something that can actually propel itself against the current. That you can get away with. Any soft plastic lures, you want it to follow that current. All right, so I've made another cast out there. Ready for another huge mistake that you can make? I'm wacky rigging. I start reeling. Bump, bump, bump. Big mistake. You don't reel a worm. A worm doesn't just cruise through the water, even if it's going with the current. You're moving it too fast at that point. Basically, with the wacky rig, you want that loose line like I told you. You want a line watch, and you just twitch. Bring your rod tip up to where you see that line go straight. As soon as it's going straight, drop your rod tip back down. You just want to twitch that worm. You just want to twitch it. You don't want to pull it. Anytime you're reeling and that line's straight, you're making a mistake. You only want to reel in slack line. Reel in slack. That's it. You don't want to reel in and pull that worm. If that worm's being pulled, trust me, you're going to get half the strikes. Twitch it in. Only retrieve loose line until you're out of that strike zone, then sure, go ahead and reel it right in. But remember, twitch the bait, only retrieve loose line. If you're reeling while you're twitching the bait, you're making a mistake. So focus on that. And that's fishing the wacky rig the right way with Nick the Informative Fisherman. We'll see you next time. Make sure to check out my website, check out my foundation. This is what I do it all for, keeping it free for you guys. Make sure to check it out. I could really use the help. Have a good one. Best of fishing.